Welcome to our deep dive into the world of economics. Looks like you guys sent in a really interesting mix of articles and videos about different economic schools of thought. So you're clearly ready to tackle some big questions about how economies work. And let's be honest, who isn't at least a little fascinated by money and what makes the world tick?
Absolutely. And you know what I find fascinating is that even though economics affects us every day, the study of it really kind of boils down to this one fundamental question. How do we possibly satisfy unlimited wants with limited resources? That's the core dilemma, really, and it's why all these different schools of economic thought have emerged, each with their own unique perspective on solutions.
It's like we all agree on the problem, but not necessarily on the solution, huh?
Precisely, and that's what makes it so interesting, right? So today we're going to explore three major economic schools of thought, starting with classical, then we'll move to Austrian, and finally Keynesian economics. Think of them like different lenses for viewing the same economic landscape.
Okay, I like that. So let's start with classical economics, since that seems like the foundation for everything that came after. And it all started with Adam Smith and his book, The Wealth of Nations, right? He was writing when things were really shifting from mercantilism, which is, that idea about hoarding gold, to the rise of factories and mass production.
Yeah, exactly. Smith was observing this incredible shift, and he argued that free markets were the key to unlocking true wealth creation. He believed that if you let people trade freely and specialize in what they're good at, everybody benefits.
Did he use the example of like a pin factory to illustrate that idea?
He did. Imagine trying to make a pin from scratch, right? You'd have to mine the ore and then refine the metal, then shape it, sharpen it. It'd take forever. But if you divide the labor up with specialized workers for each step, production just skyrockets and the cost plummets. That's the magic of the free market, Smith argued. It harnesses individual self-interest to create a more prosperous society for everyone.
So it's like the saying, a rising tide lifts all boats.
That's a good way to put it. Although that specific phrase actually came later, the core concept is definitely there in Smith's work. He believed that individuals pursuing their own self-interest would create these unintended benefits for society as a whole.
It's kind of a radical idea, isn't it? The idea that being selfish can actually lead to a better society? Seems counterintuitive, but I guess that's what helped spark the Industrial Revolution, huh? So it got classical economics laying the foundation, but then the Austrian school comes along and kind of adds another layer to it, right?
Yes. The Austrian school kind of emerged as this refinement of classical economics. They're like, hey, economies aren't just these big blobs of production. They're made up of individuals making choices.
So the Austrian school is all about understanding what drives those individual choices, right?
Exactly. Economists like Karl Menger and his student Friedrich von Mises introduced the concept of marginal utility. It's basically a fancy way of saying that each additional unit of a good provides, less and less satisfaction.
Like, the first slice of pizza is amazing, the second is still good, but by the time you get to slice number 5, you're probably not enjoying it quite as much.
Precisely. And that diminishing satisfaction, that's key to understanding consumer behavior and demand. The Austrian school said it's not just about producing more stuff, it's about producing the right stuff, the stuff people actually value. So they shifted the focus to consumer demand and its power to shape markets.
So it sounds like the Austrian school really puts the individual front and center in the economic universe, right?
They did. But this reliance on perfectly rational consumers, well, that's also where the Austrian school begins to diverge from more mainstream economic thought. Because, let's be honest, we don't always make rational choices, do we?
Definitely not. Sometimes my decisions make absolutely no economic sense. But before we get into, the quirks of human behavior, let's talk about our third major player, John Maynard Keynes and the rise of Keynesian economics.
Great point. Let's move on to Keynes. Keynes really shook things up in the early 20th century, and especially during the Great Depression.
Yeah, he challenged that whole idea that economies would just kind of self-correct and said, no, the government has got to step in. They can and should play a role in stabilizing things.
He was all about government intervention, right? Which is like a pretty big contrast to the Austrian school's emphasis on individual freedom and all that.
Exactly. Keynes introduced this idea of countercyclical fiscal policy, which basically means that governments should spend more during recessions, to try to stimulate demand, and then tax more during those economic booms to try to prevent things from overheating.
So it's almost like an economic thermostat, right? Adjusting the temperature to maintain stability.
Exactly. That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And this whole idea was pretty revolutionary at the time. It actually led to things like the New Deal programs here in the U.S., which was this massive government spending spending on infrastructure and all these social programs. But of course, that kind of approach sparked a ton of debate with the Austrian school, right? They were like super skeptical of too much government intervention.
Absolutely. The Austrian school folks, they argued that government intervention often just distorts markets and leads to all these unintended consequences. They were big believers in the idea that the free market, guided by individual choices, was ultimately more efficient and effective at allocating resources.
It's almost like you've got two chefs in the kitchen arguing, right? One's like, let the ingredients speak for themselves, and the other one's saying, no, a little seasoning goes a long way. But if you'll pardon the pun, it does seem like Keynesian economics really added some spice to the whole economic debate.
It did. And it continues to be this major influence on economic policy even today. I know you sent in some articles about some current economic challenges, so let's maybe look at how these different schools of thought might approach some of these issues. For example, one article you shared talked about, the rising cost of housing that we're seeing in a lot of cities. What do you think, a classical economist might say about that?
Well, if I'm remembering my Adam Smith correctly, they'd probably say that it's a pretty simple matter of supply and demand, right? If more and more people want to live in a certain city and there aren't enough houses to go around, then naturally prices are going to go up.
Exactly. They might argue that the solution is to, reduce those regulations that restrict new housing development. That way the market can just build more homes and hopefully bring those prices back down.
What about the Austrian school, though? What do you think they'd say about this? Well, they'd probably focus more on individual choices and incentives, right? Maybe they'd say that people are choosing to live in these expensive cities because of things like job opportunities or, all the cultural attractions. And perhaps they'd say if people were a little more flexible about where they lived, maybe the problem wouldn't be as bad.
That's an interesting point. They might also point to some government policies that end up distorting those housing markets, things like zoning regulations or tax breaks that favor homeownership over renting. Now, how about the Keynesians? What would they say about these rising housing costs?
Well, I'm thinking the Keynesians would probably see a role for government intervention, right? Maybe things like rent control policies or subsidies to encourage the construction of more affordable housing.
Exactly. They'd probably argue that the market alone just can't solve this problem, especially for lower income households that are getting priced out of their communities. They might propose government programs to help people afford housing or encourage the development of more affordable options. So you see, each of these schools of thought kind of brings a different perspective to the table. There's really no one right answer. But I think understanding these different approaches can help us have a more informed debate about solutions.
It's kind of like having a toolkit with all these different tools for different jobs, right? You wouldn't try to use a hammer to tighten a screw.
Exactly. And knowing which economic tool is going to work best, well, that depends on the specific problem that you're trying to solve and your understanding of, how economies actually function.
Yeah, I'm definitely starting to see how understanding these different schools of thought can really help make sense of this complex world that we live in. But we've only got time for one more part to this deep dive, so let's move on to our final thoughts.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of economic thought. We've been exploring these different schools of thought, each with its own take on how economies work and, how we can solve economic problems.
Yeah, it's been quite the journey. Through, the history of economic ideas, we started with those foundational ideas of classical economics, explored the individualistic focus of the Austrian school, and then we examined the role of government intervention in Keynesian economics. Now, we even saw how those different schools might approach a modern issue, like the rising cost of housing. It's kind of wild how these ideas, some of which are centuries old, are still so relevant to the problems we face today.
Right. That's the beauty of economics, I think. It's about understanding those fundamental principles that, drive human behavior and ultimately shape the world around us. But, like you pointed out earlier, the world is constantly changing, and we're facing all these new challenges these days, like climate change, technological disruption, globalization.
Right, exactly. And it makes me wonder, how can these different schools of thought help us navigate these new problems, right? For example, one article you mentioned discussed the impact of automation on jobs. That's a big one these days. How do you think each school might approach that issue?
That's a great question. Well, a classical economist might argue that, automation, while it's disruptive in the short term, ultimately leads to greater efficiency and productivity. So they might say that those jobs that are lost to automation are going to be replaced by new jobs in other sectors as the economy kind of, adapts and evolves.
So they would basically have like faith in the market's ability to just kind of adjust and create new opportunities. Right?
Exactly. They'd probably also emphasize the need for workers to adapt, right? Like to acquire new skills so they can stay competitive in a changing job market. What about the Austrian school, though? What do you think their perspective would be?
Well, they always seem to focus on individual entrepreneurs, right? So maybe they'd say that automation actually frees up human capital to focus on more creative and higher value tasks.
You got it. And they might also be, pretty vocal against government intervention, things like job protection programs, because they'd say that those policies actually just hinder the natural process of creative destruction that ultimately drives economic progress. Now, how about those Keynesians? What do you think they'd say about the challenges of automation?
Well, the Keynesians would probably be concerned about, mass unemployment and maybe even social unrest caused by, like, rapid automation. They seem to advocate for more government programs to help workers who are, like, displaced by things like automation, right?
Yeah.
Things like retraining initiatives or income support.
You're right. They might also call for policies that encourage job creation in sectors that are, less susceptible to automation, or even, explore things like a universal basic income to ensure like a social safety net in an increasingly automated world.
Wow, it's really interesting to see how all these different perspectives can like shed light on such a complex issue.
It is, and that's really what I hope you take away from this whole deep dive, like this deeper understanding of all the different frameworks that we use to think about economics. By understanding these different lenses, I think we can better understand the world around us, make more informed decisions, and ultimately contribute to creating like a more just and prosperous future for everyone.
This has been such an incredible journey through the world of economics. I feel like I've learned so much. So what's like the one key takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with today?
I think the most important thing is to stay curious, like stay engaged with economic ideas. Don't be afraid to challenge those assumptions, explore different perspectives, and just keep asking questions.
I love that. Economics isn't just some abstract academic subject, right? It's about understanding the forces that shape our lives and having a say in how those forces are directed. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of economic thought.